It's a very great pleasure for me as Vice-Chancellor Birkbeck to welcome you to the third of our bicentenary lectures to commemorate our bicentenary year. We've had a couple of very interesting lectures around the theme of business and education and around the theme of the arts. All as part of our celebration of the 200th anniversary. I try not to make my next comment because I keep making it, but there are people I think here who perhaps haven't heard it, which is that not many institutions reach their 200th anniversary, but still fewer reach it doing something that their founders would recognize. And I think if George Birkbeck were to miraculously step out of his portrait in our council room and join us, I think he might not understand the detail, but he would understand, I think, what we are doing. And what he was doing, what was the central theme of what he was doing? Accessibility. So it was all about individuals and people who, for whatever reason, different, of course, 200 years ago to now, were excluded from education, were unable to gain what Eric Hobsbawm called the benefits of universal knowledge. And so Birkbeck was about that. It was one of the very first institutions of higher learning to admit women. Some of you may have heard the joke, which was not a joke, that we apparently at this time there was a big debate in the governing body, this is about 1826, as to whether women could enter by the front door. So women were now invited, of course, to enter by the front door, along with everybody else, and of course the issues of accessibility, disability, and so on are a theme which our speaker tonight, Lord Holmes, has pursued extraordinarily energetically through his amazing career as a Paralympian. I've tried to add up the number of medals that he got in the various Paralympic Games, but I think he won 6 gold medals in one of those, let alone all the other ones. And of course, he was, I think, the leader of the organising committee for the very successful London Paralympics. So it is my very great pleasure tonight to invite Lord Holmes to give a lecture which I think its theme resonates tremendously with the themes of Birkbeck, and it's entitled Our Digital Future. So please welcome Lord Holmes, who's going to speak to us.
Good evening. Just want to check before we start. Everybody warm enough? Good. Welcome to all of you and welcome to everybody who's joining us online. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be with you this evening. I'd like to thank Birkbeck for such a kind invitation. And as the Vice-Chancellor said, really, ultimately, it's all about education, not just our sword and our shield. Education, our very armour of life. And what I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about my career, what I'm doing in Parliament, a little bit how I see things going forward, and a lot about how I believe we secure our digital future. Because ultimately, it is going to be a digital future, and much of that is already a digital future now. But if we consider data and how that is either given up by us or purloined, if we consider many of the digital platforms more extractive than open cast coal mining, you can see and understand many of the challenges that are in front of us. So I want to kick that around, come up with some solutions, and then most importantly, really keen to get all of your questions and comments when we wrap. There's also drinks afterwards, apparently, so bear with. So why am I interested in this? I grew up in the West Midlands in post-industrial decline, a very non-diverse town where we are expected to just go and work in the local carpet factories or foundries. Foundries and factories that are already foundering in post-industrial decline. And even with those odds set against me, when I was 14, I went to bed one night, and when I woke up, I couldn't see I'd lost my sight overnight. And yes, it was people, friends, family, teachers, swim coaches. It was people that got me through. But it was also digital technology. Very basic, a very basic laptop with speech output software on it. But it taught me at that age 14 that technology doesn't need to be super. Worse still, if it's described as magical or mystical, it needs to be sufficient. And it was that technology sufficient enough to enable me to continue. But if we think about our digital futures, we're not in a great time for the narrative at the moment. It's extraordinarily hyped, and it's extraordinarily shot through with fear. To put it in terms, the bots are coming, our jobs are going, we're all off to hell, and we don't even know if there's a handcart. Or, to put it another way, are the bots going to take our jobs before they kill us, or vice versa? But I don't think we need to have these counsels of despair. I believe we can be rationally optimistic about this future, this participative future that we have in front of us. And why I believe that is because if we get the combination of inclusion and technology right, that will give us the best chance of making an extraordinary success of the opportunity which is in front of us. I was lucky enough to start in Parliament almost a decade ago. I know time has no linear form since COVID. I mean, a decade or last week, it's pretty much the same thing now, isn't it, really? And everything that I've done there is to try and push on inclusion and innovation, talent and technology, working on digital inclusion, financial inclusion. I've done select committee reports on AI, on democracy and digital technologies, digital skills, financial exclusion. I wrote a report off my own back on distributed ledger technology, but all of it seeking to optimize technologies for public good, for private good, for common good, to optimize the opportunity that we have in front of us. That's a pretty quick canter through what I'm doing in Parliament. Really happy to take up any of those points afterwards at the drinks, or also do please be in contact on LinkedIn, Twitter, and indeed other social media platforms which we all know exist. But how do we optimize inclusion and technology to get the most out of this? Probably the greatest recent example that I've been involved with was being at the Turing Institute, where they had their AI conference a few months ago. And they had a number of presentations, but the thing which was most impressive right in the midst of it all was 6 of their young researchers presenting 90-second pitches for their ideas. And all of their ideas were around the deployment of AI to solve a social issue, a public issue, using algorithmic power for the allocation of public resources in 90-second pitches. One, to look at AI and what it could do to address the issue of homelessness. One, to look at what AI could do to address the issue of human trafficking. Sensational stuff, and it really brought home the point that we become what we behold. We may initially shape our tools, but thereafter our tools will shape us. And understanding that interaction that we have, the talents and the technology, I think is absolutely critical to making a success of this. The pitch that won was deploying AI to look at CT cancer scans to early diagnose ovarian cancer. Absolutely stunning stuff. What this is capable of doing in the area of health. Other AI looking at potentially diagnosing Parkinson's 15 years earlier than what's currently possible without the technology. That is inclusive AI. That's inclusive technology. That is technology for public good. And it brings me to the critical point around inclusion, which goes far beyond just inclusive technology. And that is the need for inclusion by design. Whatever technology, whatever service, whatever practice, policy, procedure we're thinking about, begin it, base it, have it all predicated on inclusive by design. There's no extra cost in doing that. And the benefits, oh my word, the benefits that flow from having it inclusive by design. If you don't, you'll exclude, you'll be suboptimal, and almost certainly at some point a retrofit will need to come in which will be less effective, more cost impacting, and just a thoroughly avoidable way of going about things. It reminds me of Stephen Hawking, one of the greatest humans ever to have lived. In 2014, he talked of the dangers of non-inclusive technology. In terms, he said that if we had full artificial intelligence, it could spell the end of civilization. But equally, it's complex because 2 years earlier, when I was running the Paralympic Games in London, I got Stephen to come and be part of the opening ceremony for the Paralympic Games. And imagine that, one of not only the most famous living disabled people, but one of the most famous disabled people of all time, being in the Paralympic Stadium and not just talking about possibilities beyond ourselves, but talking about possibilities beyond our universe. That was gravity-defying, inclusion-making chat. And it's that I think underpinned all of what Professor Hawking did. He had worries, he had fears, he had concerns about where the technology was going, but fundamentally he was rationally optimistic and truly believed in the power of inclusion. Inclusion and technology, the golden threads which run through all of this. But added to that, what else do we need? And it's why it's such a pleasure to be here this evening, because as importantly, if we are going to make a success, if we are going to have our digital futures, we need a public discourse, public debate, public discussion around every element of this. And when I started talking about this stuff in Parliament, didn't get much chat. You know, I could sense blank faces. I could sense lack of connection to the ideas and the concepts. And yet now, particularly the last 6 months, you cannot move without a story about AI or about the new technologies. ChatGPT has, in essence, been its own best PR machine. But that's good. But it's how we frame that discussion, how we frame that discourse to make it rational, realistic, optimistic without being Panglossian, but certainly not hyped or fear-laden, which is so much of where it's at the moment. So how best to construct such a dialogue, such a discourse? Ultimately, it's that greatest of human connective powers, trust, and how we enable trustworthiness. So we shouldn't say, can you trust ChatGPT? Can you trust that platform? That's not the right question. The right question is, how do they behave? How do they conduct themselves? How is their service constructed? How is the algorithm written to enable us to conceive and consider of them as being trustworthy? One of my colleagues in the Lords, Honora O'Neill, has written some of the greatest stuff on trustworthiness. I recommend that for further reading on that specific point. And we should feel confident that we can enable people, all of us, to have the comfort to consider being part of that public debate, that public discourse. Because let's take another example from history. Let's take IVF, in vitro fertilization. There could barely be something more science fiction-y than human life being made in a test tube. How can it be that that science wasn't stopped before it had even begun? Public discourse, public debate. A former colleague of mine, Baroness Warnock, who launched the Warnock Commission into IVF to enable people to be part of it, to learn about it, to consider it, to understand it, to be able to ask questions like, what's in it for me? How is this going to work? And by having that Warnock Commission, now nobody even thinks of IVF as anything other than a positive element of our society, of our humanity. But it's that public discourse, that public debate that enabled it. And on technology specifically, some really interesting research came out last week from the Ada Lovelace Institute about this to show the current human attitudes and the complexity and the nuance within it. So they put to people 17 specific applications of AI. And 10 were seen as broadly positive, 5 broadly negative, 2 finely balanced. 9 out of 10 people said they were in favour of using AI for cancer diagnosis. But then when you went into that in some more detail, 56% of those people said that they also were worried if the AI was over-deployed and the role of the consultant was underplayed in all of that consultation process. Similarly, 47% of people talked of concerns around where does the liability lie? Where does the liability fall if the technology goes wrong? Interestingly, of all of the 17 use cases, it was autonomous vehicles that people were most concerned about. 72% of people were concerned around autonomous vehicles. Interestingly, only 71% of people were concerned about autonomous weaponry. It sort of reminded me of a survey I'd read a good number of years ago about public speaking, where public speaking was said to be people's number one fear. Death was number 2. But we need that public discourse, that public debate. It's how always we get to the right considerations and the right path forward. Then, so we've got inclusion, we've got public discourse. The third piece, legislation and regulation. In some ways, I would say that, wouldn't I? But it absolutely matters how we legislate, how we regulate to optimize our digital futures. I was lucky enough to be part of the AI Select Committee. We did our report in 2018, and it was the first time in the UK where we put together a clear program for the ethical deployment, the ethical use of AI. And I think there's a real opportunity for the UK with ethical AI, particularly when tied to one of the greatest things that we have, common law, then our time zone, our geography, our language, and the City of London finance. Put all those things together, and you can see how we can potentially, in collaboration, in connection with the rest of the world, make a real success of AI and indeed all of the other technologies. It's why just on Tuesday evening, when we were doing the Financial Services and Markets Bill in Parliament, I put down amendments to suggest an AI responsible, an AI reporting officer for all financial services institutions. We all know how pervasive AI and other technologies are in our finances. It seems only right that there should be an AI responsible officer at board level to play that role in every company that is offering financial services to retail consumers. Similarly, in 2020, we did the Democracy and Digital Technologies report to get into this whole area of fake, deep fake. What is fact? What is presented as? How are things represented? how a political advert run online. And we put together a list of recommendations which is as relevant, as pertinent today as it was when we did it. Because, as I said at the outset, how can we continue working with so many platforms that are just utterly extractive rather than enabling, extractive rather than emancipating? The only product they have is our data. And by the way, if you're not paying for a product, odds on you are the product. It's our data. So lots of recommendations from that report about how we can make our democracy more vibrant if we fundamentally understand how to position digital technologies. Jumping to another piece of work on more into deep technology, I've just completed the work on the Electronic Trade Documents Bill. I've described it as the most important piece of legislation that no one has ever heard of. And I could already feel people in the room going, electronic trade, what? Oh, God, do me a favour. It's a hot day, seriously, work with me. But why I say this is, it's such a small, discrete piece of legislation. It simply enables trade documents to be held in electronic format. Currently, you have to have them as paper. They are possessive documents. They're not like a contract. So if you hold the paper, you hold the goods. Well, imagine what the situation is. There's a ship outside the port of Singapore, but the paperwork is on the runway at Heathrow, and COVID comes. What do you do? The goods can't move. It's all about holding the paper, you hold the goods. This couldn't change until the technology existed to enable someone to hold an electronic document, prove that no one else could hold that electronic document, and prove that they were the sole holder at that point in time of that document. Currently, it's blockchain, which enables that technology. And if we get it right, by the end of July, we will be the first G7 country to have passed this groundbreaking piece of legislation. Groundbreaking economically, but groundbreaking environmentally. Because imagine, rather than what it currently takes now, 7 to 10 days for the exchange of goods via paper trade documents, now that can be done in seconds. Good economics. But imagine, now it can be done in seconds. Nobody has to get a flight from Heathrow to Singapore. All of that fuel, all of that environmental impact taken away in seconds, and done in a way where blockchain isn't burning the planet, and there's a clear understanding between how to structure blockchain so they're environmentally friendly of themselves as well. It's why in 2017 I wrote a report off my own back on distributed ledger technology for public good, because of that issue around the environmental impact potential of these technology, and people seeing Bitcoin and blockchain as the same thing. I was at a conference a few years ago where somebody said, at the end of this conference, we're going to be giving away to every person here £20 of blockchain. Right. I mean, is it heavy? What format does it come in? But that highlighted the issue. And I knew that if we didn't say a lot more about the opportunities of blockchain and understanding the difference between proof of work and proof of stake and understanding permissioned and non-permissioned, then potentially all of those benefits of DLT could be lost before we'd even begun them. And I'll just give one quick example. Currently in the UK, 25,000 doctor days are spent in proving their credentials. Incredibly important. You want to know that the person operating on you, the person you go for a consult with, the person who's dispensing a prescription to you, you want to know that they are the person they say they are with the qualifications they say they've got at that time that you see them. So important. But with a very straightforward distributed ledger technology solution, those 25,000 doctor days can be collapsed into seconds, and those 25,000 doctor days can be converted into care. Technology for public good. Not just considering how do we bring more resource to bear, how do we optimize the resource we currently have. Now, it's interesting, when you look at many of the writers on all this stuff. Max Tegmark says that the technology has moved much faster than he thought, and policy has moved much slower. Now, I can sympathise to an extent with that point of view, having been on this journey for at least a decade in a formal role in Parliament. But also, if we consider that we've now had the AI white paper, we've now had the European statement on AI passed just yesterday, there's plenty more reasons to be cheerful in this space and to consider that stuff is happening. But again, we need to be part of it, we need to be aware of it, we need to be sensitive to what is happening on all of those developments. It's critical that it isn't just a matter for parliamentarians, though that's important when it comes to the legislation and the regulation. It's for the whole of civil society to come and be part of this. Now, I was at the AI Summit this morning over at the somewhat unfortunately named now Tobacco Dock, but it is what it is. Again, you've got to work with what you're given sometimes. Tobacco Dock. And they had the Taiwanese digital minister there, and he was so impressive. But one thing that he talked about, which is pertinent to our discussions this evening, he talked about the people's assemblies that they have around all this technology, enabling people to be part of it, to co-create, to consider, to be part of the discourse and the debate in Taiwan. I'm going to be working with him to see how we can bring more of that to this country, right up and down the country as well. Because if levelling up means anything, it has to mean that everybody can be part of all of these discussions and have an equal right to be part of it, wherever you happen to be born, live, work, or reside in this entire country. But when it comes to it, let's return to those core elements. Data. It's in our hands. We need to conceive of it as our data rather than just give it away or let it be purloined away. Our data. We decide what, we decide to who, we decide for what purpose and for what length of time. When it comes to digital platforms particularly, we need to no longer accept extractive models that do nothing for enablement or emancipation. It's critical that we all coalesce around a digital ID. Now, ID has always been a complicated issue in any nation, but particularly in our nation when it gets connected to seen as impacting on freedoms. But the whole purpose of a self-sovereign digital ID again, is that we hold it. We have the credentials. I give a really straightforward example. If you go to a bar, as some of you may from time to time, and you want to have a drink, you don't need to show your driving license. You don't need to show your passport. You don't need to show something like that. And yet, that currently is often what's asked for if there's a sense of, are you of age to have that alcoholic drink? But the truth of it is that bartender doesn't need to know your name, doesn't need to know anything about you. She or he doesn't even need to know your date of birth. All they need to know is that you are of age at that moment in time to order that drink and for the time that you drink that drink. Self-sovereign digital ID, your credentials in your hand, you share that credential and they know that. They don't have to know anything more about you. Our digital ID in our hands with us able to control it. So the data, the digital and the digital ID. Inclusion, public discourse and absolutely right-sized, right-considered, inclusive legislation and regulation. Because ultimately, if we don't get this right, this won't be a failure of the technologies, it will be a failure of us. And we need to stop othering AI. AI's biased. AI's not biased. The data that goes into it, which we've put together, may well be biased. The approaches, the techniques, the training, that may be biased. But it's not biased of itself. It's biased because it was built in such a way. The technology, it's out to get us. Only if it's been humanly constructed in such a way. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our digital technologies. It's in ourselves if we end up being underlings. Ultimately, we need to have that rational optimism, that sense of knowing that if we have human talent leading the technology, we can get to the right outcomes. And we all have a role to play. We all have an individual voice and a collective voice in this matter. To everybody, use that voice. Connect with ChatGPT. Try it out. See how it goes. Try the other bits and bobs that are out there through other providers. Learn how it operates. Learn what it can, learn what it can't do. Understand how it can be put to positive purposes. We all have a role to play. We all have a voice. The voice must be used and must be heard in this debate. That is how we'll overcome the fear. That is how we'll take the air out of the hype. And ultimately, it comes back to the very purpose of this institution that we're in this evening. It comes back to that absolute armor of light that we put on for life when we have a great education. Our data, our decisions, our digital future. It's in our hands. It's down to us. Our digital futures. Thank you very much. Questions?
May I? Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question about the very last point that you made, and I made lots of notes on somebody's reserved piece of paper, which wasn't mine. Thank you very much. I'm a Birkbeck ex-student. I graduated in law and politics and sociology from here. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Robin O'Reilly. I'm a Birkbeck ex-student. I graduated in law in 2001 and did a master's in sociology and politics. I veered before and since into civil liberties and human rights and elements like that. And I have loved your lecture. I've loved the underlying humour and hope, and I've also loved the sense of empowerment in everything that you have said. But the place that I come from today to this is a place full of concern, and concern about civil liberties, concern about social controls. But I'll take it to a funnier place. You spoke about taking the air out of the hype just now. And I said, I was already forming a thought. If we have human talent, which is what you said, leading outcomes, we can all get to the right place. And I wrote, why so? When I have called any service providers in recent time, including my bank, over an illicit transaction only on Saturday morning, it took 1 hour and 57 minutes for me to get the robot to leave me alone. And the air and the hype comes to mind because I started out with a balloon-sized amount of enthusiasm, and the air hissed very quickly out of my balloon after 1 hour and 57 minutes. And I would love to have your possibly, most likely, very humoured thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I imagine many people in the theatre this evening and online can recognise exactly that. And that is the human wrong deployment of the technology for the wrong aims and the wrong ends. And it's why individually and more importantly collectively we need to act against that and to look for, in that specific example, to look at, say, where open banking can play a role if rightly constructed, where we can take more control through open banking and peer-to-peer payments, cut out the intermediaries, cut out that part of it, look at some of the new players in the market, not waving a flag for any of them particularly, but just that sense of what we can know is it always takes longer than it ought, but the value proposition should always come through. But it will only do that if we all stick to wanting that, rather than, exactly as you say, we can easily just think it's too much, it's exhausting. And it can be, and it really can be exhausting, but just to go, no, I'm not going to accept the world as it is. I'm not going to accept this service as it is. I am going to go through one of the most painful things in this instance of changing bank, changing financial service provider. It's horrific, but it's taking action and truly believing that we've had the great good fortune to be born human, so we need to exercise agency. And to your underlying point, I completely understand why you would come with those concerns around the human condition, around privacy, around individual and collective liberties, because absolutely critical. If we don't construct these technologies and deploy them in the right way, we've got serious problems. That's why exactly I had inclusion and inclusive by design as the first of the 3 key pillars for how we go about this. Thank you.
We have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. The student ambassadors will bring the microphone. If you can talk really clearly into the microphone.
Thank you for that very engaging speech. My name's Rick Payne, researching the communication of data science. You put great store by public debate, and I wondered what you felt about how the standard of public debate has developed over, say, the last 20 years, where you see it's going. A lot of people would say it's been undermined by social media. If we look around, you can see lots of examples where public debate doesn't seem to be very strong, and I wondered where you see it going and what we need to do to improve the standard of public debate.
Thank you very much, and very much agree. And in the foreword to our Democracy and Digital Technologies report on that point, we said nothing short. We need a resurrection of public debate, a resurrection which would lead to a resurrection of public trust. It's exactly in your question, it's at that level that needs nothing short of a resurrection. And it is beholden on all of us, and particularly those in leadership roles in companies, in education institutions, everybody across the piece, because it is always collective effort, and it needs to change. It needs to not be in the current polarized, retreatist, populist place that it's currently in. And there's a horrific, it seems to me, irony at the core of all of this, that we've never been more connected, and yet we've seldom seen so much populism, retreatism, isolation, an epidemic of loneliness and mental well-being. That is a cruel irony that we absolutely need to wrestle with and fundamentally shift.
Hi, I'm Katie Huang. I work a lot in the technology and insurance space, and my question's actually to do with EdTech. So I'm a school governor for a local primary and secondary school, and I've seen AI deployed really effectively in personalizing education. And you obviously mentioned when you went blind, it was very effective. The basic technology was really effective in helping you continue. And I was just curious your views on how that either closes the disadvantage gap and the digital divide, or are we setting up another barrier for the less fortunate, if you call them that?
Thank you. You put your finger on the question which is at the epicenter of so many of the questions, the fact that it could go either way. So currently, you've got a horrific education attainment gap between different socioeconomic groups, disabled people and non-disabled people, and so on. Personalised EdTech could be a key part of the solution, again, if it's human-led. So what that means is we need to put the support, the training, the wraparound, the teachers, our educators, those who teach the teachers, all of that needs to be in place so it can, everybody, first of all, the school leaders, right through all the staff, it's that point of having the comfort and then the confidence to act and interact with the technology in classroom and other education settings. But absolutely of itself, it can be such a powerful part of the solution, human-led. But as with all of this, it's not an inevitability. It's how much we will it and how much we ensure that that does become the outcome.
Next question, please.
Thank you for your talk, Lord Holmes. My question is, I was listening to a webinar about a couple of weeks ago by the Bank of England. They want to bring in a digital pound. Is what you're doing connected to the digital pound? That's just my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a really interesting subject area around central bank digital currencies and the digital pound, because again, it touches on all of the issues that we've discussed so far this evening around inclusion, around the potential to enable more financial inclusion, potentially, but not inevitably. But then there are also all of the issues around privacy. Because imagine if you could have a ledger where you have everybody's transaction history. That is an extraordinarily powerful means of control, manipulation, and if put to the bad, very, very powerful to put to that bad purpose. But if got right, what you could do with programmable money, extraordinary potential. In last year, the Chinese launched their prototype CBDC when they were hosting the Winter Olympics. I only raise it because it enabled me to write one of my favourite headlines of recent times, CBD ski. I know, it's not great, but it was as good as I could come up with at that time. But you can understand how to optimise what you could do with a CBDC through understanding the social, political, economic, historical, philosophical context of any nation state. Understand all of that way before you get into any of the difficulties of the technology and the operationalisation of it. But it's certainly a really, whether we end up with a CBDC, I think we'll go wholesale before we go retail. It's the easier part of it for obvious reasons. And that is probably end of this decade. But whether we do or don't, it's still worth the journey for the learnings that will come out from that for other potential uses of digital technologies in the financial services space.
Hello.
Next question, please.
I have the mic here. I'm Martin Woodford. I'm a student here doing corporate governance. And I wonder if you can comment on some of the main impacts of emerging technologies, either good or bad, on climate change and the UK net zero targets, for example.
Thank you. I think I've said a lot that this year needs to be the year of ESG, and it needs to be the year where the S and the G are equally understood and pushed for as the E. It's understandable why the E gets so much attention. It's existential, that's understandable. But the S and the G, as you would well know what you're studying, are as important as that. So the technologies have extraordinary potential in how, you just think of a simple use of algorithmic deployment to optimize the current energy that we have. If you look at it in the automotive context, we only need 15% of the current number of cars that are out there to satisfy all of our car mobility needs. So on that, I must say, my view is I don't get particularly excited about EVs, individual personally owned EVs, as being a particularly massive step forward. I think we need to be more imaginative and more radical about how we look about our mobility needs. But in terms of how technologies can be deployed, not just in terms of interesting carbon capture, how we get the energy from offshore, all of that, balancing baseload, all of those things, very, very interesting. But I think, again, it will only come to fruition if there's that understanding of the overriding context and what we're looking to achieve. So again, huge potential, but needs to be understood where we are, what that potential is, how we're going to get there.
Next question, please.
You mentioned the hype around AI kind of within the media, and one of the other kind of core elements that's being discussed is both about the needs to pump the brakes on the development of AI, as well as the need for legislation and regulation. My question is, how can you effectively legislate and regulate a technology which, as you've mentioned as well, is very much kind of in its infancy in where we're at, without stifling kind of the technology as IVF? So how do you balance that?
Thank you very much. There's good examples from recent history into how we could go about that. So on the sort of regulatory framework, if we look about what we did with the fintech sandbox, so sandbox is a really good concept for how we can go about enabling startup and scale-ups to begin in a safe regulatory environment alongside the regulator in this sandbox context. So what's the measure of success of the fintech sandbox? Well, replicated in well over 50 jurisdictions around the world. So it's conceptually very good. Absolutely, we should be looking at a whole variety of sandboxes that could be set up, not to say we sandbox AI or we seek to regulate large language models, because that's a bit like saying we're going to try and regulate maths. It's also called math these days. I don't know where the S went. I must be, I don't know. I mean, again, that's quite efficient though, isn't it? That it was a 5-letter word, then it became a 4-letter word. If it's like trying to regulate math. You wouldn't see us do that. It's looking at the use cases, the deployments, the sectors where it's happening, and how then you regulate in those areas. And looking at, again, what we've just done with the Financial Services and Markets Bill, by introducing an international competitiveness objective as a secondary objective for our financial services regulators. That again demonstrates how we need to break free from the polarization of debates that it's either about consumer protection or it's about innovation, and they're the polar opposites. Not a bit of it. We know how to regulate, to have a multi-objective approach where you have the innovation, the competitiveness, the consumer protection, the market stability objectives, which can all very well coexist. Not easy, of course it's not easy, but it's completely doable. So very much looking at the use cases of AI, looking at sandboxing, and also looking at principles approach regulation. And again, back to an earlier point I made, the great good fortune that we have to have common law, so we can set stuff in primary and secondary legislation, and then we have precedent to enable that to develop in a very orderly, well-trusted and well-delivered approach, I believe, compared to other jurisdictions that don't have that common law tradition.
We've time for one more question.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for your insightful keynote speech and this opportunity. My name is Avril Coelho, a former disabled Richmond councillor British Epilepsy Association trustee and disability champion. My question is, how far in the future do you anticipate that large funding bodies will be using AI to create fair, equitable policy so that S15 Deaflympic swimmers and athletes receive equity with Paralympic and Olympic athletes and swimmers? And how can you help rectify this before then, should that be a long time in the future?
Really, absolutely. You go to the heart of, again, where if we get it right, we can have that right combination of human-led technology to resolve seemingly, unnecessarily seemingly, intractable difficulties. So, to your question, over what time period? In many ways, there's no reason why it needs to be a long time period, but for reasons that aren't related to the issue itself or to the technology, it may well be, and hence that sense of taking us back to the need for a different kind of dialogue. It's not about having a dialogue around the technologies, particularly in your question, but it's having that dialogue to move these seemingly intractable issues on, and then into and this is how technology can help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Holmes. I'd like to invite everyone to show their appreciation for Lord Holmes. And also invite everybody to join us for a reception following this event. And this will be an opportunity for you to continue conversations that have been sparked during this Q&A and the lecture, and also forge some new connections. So please do join us outside.